Welcome. My name is Laura Karstensen, and I am director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. And we're delighted to have you here with us today and to welcome Bill Frey and a group of panelists who are going to have a conversation with him and with you after Dr. Frey's talk. At the Stanford Center on Longevity, our mission is to redesign long life. And we are often mistaken for a center on aging or old people. But longevity is about all stages in life. And millennials are the first generation ever in human history to be able to anticipate with considerable certainty that they will live very long lives. So other people are living these long lives, but doing so almost by surprise. Well, we're living a lot longer than we thought. Not so anymore for young people today. And so a consideration of who millennials are, what they're like, and how the country will change as a function of this new infusion of a diverse population is important for all of us to understand. We get to hear today from the nation's demographer, William Frey, and I'm going to turn to my colleague Martha Deevy for a proper introduction. But welcome to all of you.
I always have to move the mic way down. Anyhow, I'm Martha Deevy. I'm the assistant director at the Stanford Center on Longevity. And it is my great privilege to welcome you here this afternoon. And thank you for being here on the first Friday of summer. Beautiful sunny afternoon, and it's Friday. So I think this will be time well spent, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the time with us this afternoon. We are so lucky to welcome Bill Frey to talk with us this afternoon about his latest report, The Millennial Generation, A Demographic Bridge to America's Diverse Future. Bill, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, as Laura mentioned, is often introduced as the nation's demographer and is internationally known for his work on urban populations, migration, immigration, race, aging, political demographics, and his expertise on the US Census. There's probably a number of other things I could put on that list, but that's all that fit on my paper. He has authored over 200 publications and several books during his career, and in fact, his most recent book, The Diversity Explosion, How New Racial Demographics Are Remaking America, has been updated and is going to be re-released on July 10th. Bill has a long, illustrious academic research career with universities and institutions across the country. And I actually was aware of Bill's work long before I got to meet him because he has an amazing ability to communicate complex and dense demographic trends to a lay population, of which I am one. His work is often seen in the presented to the general public. It's been featured in many national newspapers and magazines. And if you think he looks a little familiar, it's probably because you've seen him on TV. His commentary and observations have been featured on NPR, PBS NewsHour, NBC Nightly News, ABC World News, CBS Evening News, C-SPAN's Washington Journal. So when you stand up here and go, I know him from somewhere, you probably do. So before I turn the podium over to Bill, the way our afternoon's going to work, Bill's going to speak for a while. We're then going to welcome up our millennial panel. And after that panel, we'll invite Q&A from the audience. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bill Frey to Stanford.
I'm really pleased to be here for this opportunity to talk with the audience here, sponsored by the Stanford Longevity Center. Oftentimes people hear that there's a demographer going to speak, and it doesn't generate excitement. I don't know the deal, but here it is on Friday afternoon, a very nice day, and there's a big group of people here, so I appreciate that you're all here. I have a confession to make. I'm not a millennial. There are various different ways to define millennials. We define them here as people born between 1981 and 1997, but other people use different definitions. No matter what definition you use, I'm way outside of it. So I'm talking about millennials. I'm not a millennial, but as you have just heard, we're going to have a panel with real millennials, and that's going to be important. How many millennials are in the audience? Okay, so that's a very nice group. This presentation and this discussion afterwards is just as much for the people who didn't raise their hands as the people who did, because I think we need to understand as a country the importance of millennials for our future, and particularly with respect to their being what I think of as a bridge to the diverse America, the racially diverse America that we're coming. I started thinking about all these demographic changes, especially after the 2010 census was released. And I've been doing demography for a long time. But even after I looked at the results of the 2010 census, I said, you know, wow, there are big changes going on in the U.S., especially with respect to racial and ethnic diversity that even I didn't anticipate. And a few years after that, with the good help of the Brookings Institution, I was given the wherewithal to write this book, Diversity Explosion, which is now going to come out as an updated version, in order to explore this to some degree. And as a result of the results of that work and many talks that I've given after I published that book for different kinds of audience, it became very clear to me that we're moving toward a division, kind of a generational division in the United States, where older non-millennials, people my age and people around my age, have a different view of the way the country's going than the millennial population and the people younger than them. And I started to think that the millennials really are kind of a bridge generation. They're a generation that will help to sort of move things along, sort of get these two pieces of the generational divide together and helping them understand what's going on. And I think that's certainly going to be the case. Millennials, by virtue of their accomplishments, by virtue of the fact that they serve as role models for younger people who are younger than millennials, and the fact that they may be able to overcome especially racial and ethnic barriers in the United States, either because of their own influence and their own abilities, but because they'll make their attention known to everyone around us, people who didn't raise your hands and say you're not millennials, to help them move along, will help the country close this generation gap. And that's why I think they're a bridge to a more racially diverse generation. And so that's what this report is about, the Millennial Generation. I thought when I sat down to write it that I have not really seen, I mean, there's lots of stuff written about millennials, but I've not really seen someone who's taken a clear-cut look at the broad view of the millennials in terms of their geographical distribution and in terms of their demographic attributes, but also in terms of their role as a bridge to the next diverse generations in the United States. And that was the goal that I put this book in. So there are a couple of several different questions we're going to answer or try to answer that I discuss in the report. One is, who are millennials and how distinct are they? 2 is, where are millennials living? 3 is, how do their socioeconomic characteristics differ? You know, if you read a lot of the newspaper, you get to think that all millennials are young professionals living in Brooklyn or in San Francisco, but that's not really true. We'll get to the first one. How are millennials and how distinct are they? Now, this is sort of a broad overview of how millennials might be a bridge in terms of the race and ethnic profiles of their generation compared to other generations. This is a chart which shows the race-ethnic composition of 4 broad age groups, those age 55 and over, which include most, and these numbers are from 2015. I did it that way so that all of the data could be available for that same year. So back then in 2015, people age 55 and over were most baby boomers and people older than baby boomers, 75% white. People age 35 to 54, largely Generation Xers, but a few baby boomers in there, 62% white. And by the way, the Generation X racial profile in the United States is pretty much the same as the national racial profile. You just have a similar kind of, in terms of the proportion of different racial groups that are in the Generation X cohort. The millennial generation, which is focused on here, are the people age 18 to 34 in 2015, and 56% white, 44% minority. And how they're a bridge is because they're leading into the under 18 population, 52% white, almost half minority. And in fact, new census numbers, which just came out yesterday, show that people under age 10 in the United States are more are less than 50% white every one of the years, 0 to age 9, according to those numbers. The first time that's happened, so I don't know, we can call them Generation Z plus or something like that. But we're focusing here on the millennials, which are between this kind of very whiter populations, different lifetime experiences, and what we're going to expect in the future. Now, people look at this and they say, you know, why is this happening? Well, obviously, you can look at the age distribution of these different racial groups. The white population has a median age of 43. The Hispanic population has a median age of 29. And two or more race, people who are down to themselves as two or more races, they have a median age of 20. So those folks have half the median age, less than half the median age of the white population. But why did this turn out this way? Why do we have these different racial distributions of different age groups? A lot of people think it's due to immigration, and certainly the immigration that we've had over the last 20 or 30 years have helped to do that. But if we look at now the population of the United States, especially the Latino population, but also the different Asian groups and so forth, immigration does not account for, if you lump them all together, for most of that growth. For the Latinos especially, only about 35% of the growth in the Latino population today comes from immigration. The rest comes from what we call natural increase. That's the excess of births over deaths. These are births to Latino folks who are already in the United States. So the idea that if we stop immigration, we're going to change the diversity of this country. Well, we will to some degree, but it's not going to stop this kind of pattern that we're seeing here, as well, and complemented by the aging of the white population, which isn't going to go away for quite a while. So this is here with us for a while, and it's important to understand the way the nation is changing. Now, getting back to how the millennial population fits into things, let's first go back to 1980. And this is a chart which looks something like a population pyramid, if you know what a population pyramid would. Population pyramid usually has two halves. It has a male side and a female side. This has one for the total population. And all those bars represent the size of different age groups, going down from age 0 to 4 up to age 85 and over. In 1980, the baby boom population were between the ages of 16 and 34. Almost about the same age as millennials were in 2015. Baby boomers had a huge impact. They still do today, but not like they did back then. There was kind of a youthquake of baby boomers, especially during the 1960s. Let's look at the chart for 2015. Baby boomers move up to ages 51 to 69. And there are the millennials at pretty much the same ages that baby boomers were in 1980. Now, the millennials have a little competition with baby boomers. They're not the biggest show anymore. They're a little bit larger in size than the baby boomers, but baby boomers still have some clout. But it's important to see that millennials, like baby boomers, are a little bit bigger as a generation than the generations right ahead of them and the generations right below them. I think it's important to understand because there is kind of an outsized influence that millennials are going to have, at least for the younger part of the population. And the second thing I want you to notice is you look at those two colors there. The orange bars are the minorities, racial minorities, Hispanics, Asians, American Indians, Native Alaskans, and other minority groups, people of two or more races. And the rest of it is the white population. As you go down from the lower ages, from the millennial population, you see that white population starts shrinking. So another finding that came out of the census results yesterday was that we now have an absolute decline of whites in the United States, not just an absolute decline of whites in the younger ages. So what this tells us is we move into the future. These younger generations, the post-millennial generation, they're the people that are going to be moving into the labor force. They're going to be moving into the economy. They're going to be people who are part of our consumer base and all of that. We really need to pay attention to the diversity of that. And the millennials, as a bridge into that generation, are going to be very important in paving the way for them. I want to say a little bit what I call about global attributes of the millennial generation. 25% of millennials speak a language other than English at home, often Spanish, but other languages as well. These are people who, have grown up in sometimes first or second generation Americans, as we see, are 29% of millennials. Turns out that about 1 in 6 millennials are bilingual. They speak a language other than English at home, but then they also speak English very well. So that's an important attribute of millennials. And 14% of millennials are in mixed race marriages, interracial marriages. That's compared to like 1 in 25 for baby boomers when they were that age. So there are many other kinds of attributes like that, but the millennial generation is much more global in its attributes. A lot of times when we think of millennials, we think about people living in their parents' basement. And the reason we think about that is because the recession of 2007 to 2009, the housing market crash that occurred during that period put a huge dent on the economy, and especially as the oldest millennial turned age 27 when the recession hit in 2007, it had a lot to do with their outcomes in terms of their ability to get jobs, to be ability to use their education productively over time, to be able to sort of start their lives, buy a home, move to the suburbs if that's what they want to do. And one of those things is putting off marriage. Now, obviously, generations over time have put off the age at which they got married. In the 1950s, women got married at age 20 on average, men got married at age 21. Now it's 27 and 29. So the broad social forces have brought that putting off getting married, people spending more time in college, more women in the labor force, lots of different broader trends going on. But that recession and that housing market crash had an exceptional impact on the millennial generation in addition to all of those other things. So you could see that baby boomers, look at the left-hand clump of bars, shows the percent of this generation who were married at age 25 to 34. 70% of baby boomers, 70% of white baby boomers, which is the first bar there, were married at that age, down to 48% for the millennials. Similarly, for each of the other racial groups, decline. Now, there are obviously disparities across racial groups. Blacks have lesser marriage rates than Hispanics or whites, but this trend has come down over time. And when you think about it, you can say, well, there are two things of it. Two aspects of this. People have a little bit more flexibility. They can spend more time before they make that plunge, getting married, buying a home and all this sort of thing. But it also gives them a late start on life, and I think that's an issue that millennials are going to have to deal with. It'll be interesting to see now that the economy is coming back, what's going to happen to post-millennials when they get into those ages. But this is the picture that we see now. Another attribute people think when they think about millennials is educational attainment. Millennials are the most educated generation to ever come along, and this is important. We see it here for each of these different racial groups. Again, we're compared the three generations of baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials. How many have graduated from college at the ages of 25 to 34? Well, white millennials graduated from college at 43% compared to 27% for baby boomers at the same age. And it's the same uptick, some uptick for each and every one of these racial groups. But that's the good news about this. There's a big, I think, value of education. The bad news is there's still disparity across these different racial groups between, on the one hand, Asians and whites, and on the other hand, blacks and Hispanics. There's a lot of history to this. Some of it has to do with not getting a head start in the kinds of schools they attended. Blacks in particular, but also Hispanics sometimes have grown up in segregated, under-resourced school systems. When it comes to coming to college, they may not have the same kind of benefits of having parents that have enough money to give them money for tuition or help them during bad times. And there are other things that historically keep these racial differences in play. But I think it's really important, given the demography that we looked at earlier, that more attempts are made to close those gaps, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind. Similarly for home ownership, another thing about millennials is many fewer of them have owned homes when they got to the ages of 25 to 34 than previous generations. About 39% of millennials were homeowners in 2015 compared to 47%, that's 39% for millennials, 47% for Gen Xers, and 55% for baby boomers at that same age. Now, some of that has to do with kind of delaying putting their lives together, but a lot of it has to do with the housing crunch and what happened during the period between the late first decade of the 2000s and the last few years, keeping them going. Yet again, we see there's a very sharp disparity in race home ownership. 56% of whites millennials own homes at that age, down to 33% of blacks, 37% for Hispanics. The recession and the housing crunch had a lot to do with widening those disparities in home ownership, but they're still there. So if we think about education and we think about home ownership, those are two kinds of markers about the future of a person or a generation. Education says a lot about what your lifetime earnings are going to be. If you have a good education, your lifetime earnings are projected to be a lot higher than if you don't. Home ownership is a way to accumulate wealth. If you're not a homeowner at a certain age, your chances are less likely to accumulate that wealth over time. And if we think about the generations following the millennials, the post-millennial generation, and we looked at the demography, much more likely to be maybe at this point 21 or 25% Hispanic, 5 or 7% Asian, 13 or 14% black, and closing in on minority population that's white. It means that, if those kinds of indicators that predict future wealth or predict future earnings are projected ahead, it's not a good situation. And here again, I think it's important that the millennial generation moves ahead and is given the opportunity to move ahead along these lines and close those kinds of gaps. Now, where are millennials living? We did some analysis, and we looked at millennial population growth between 2010 and 2015. Nationally, the millennial population grew by about 5% between 2010 and 2015. Some of that growth was from immigration. Some of it is cohort replacement. And I should make this a little clear. It's not so much millennial growth, but young adult growth between 2010 and 2015. So we have a bigger cohort moving into the 2010 to 2015 age group. That will increase the size of that 2010 to 2015 age group everywhere. And the reason metro areas differ in terms of the rate of that growth has to do some degree with migration going across from one metropolitan area to another. So if you look at those black dots, those are the places that have the highest growth of young adults between 2010 and 2015. And all of them are in the West and the South: Seattle, Denver, Colorado Springs, which leads them all at 14% growth, a few in Texas, a few in Florida, and Hawaii. And then the other side are a whole clump of them in the Midwest. All of them grew a little bit in terms of their young adult population. It's only Birmingham, Alabama that showed a decline. It should be a minus 0 point. The minus is over there. But places like St. Louis and Milwaukee, several small metro areas in Ohio. But clearly the growth of the millennial population is more dramatic in the South and in the West than it is in the Northeast. And so when you think about millennial growth as a nation, you have to think about what metropolitan areas are doing it. And it also differs by race. If you look at the major gaining areas for white young adults, you see a lot of them are in the South and West: Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, and Houston, Dallas. Blacks, there's a lot of literature on black migration back to the South. This has been happening really since the 1970s, but came into its own over the last 30 years. And it's also the case with black millennials. The biggest gaining metropolitan areas for blacks include Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, New York, and Washington, D.C. They gained because, again, the cohort moving into those older age groups. But if you took a longer list, you'd see that some of the major gaining areas are in the South for African Americans. What about Hispanics? Well, they tend to be gaining largely in places that already have large Hispanic populations. So these are the greatest young adult gainers for Hispanics: Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, Riverside, San Antonio. And for Asian Americans, West Coast areas, as you can see, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, Houston, and New York. But depending on what group you're talking about, I also have in the report a chart that shows those metropolitan areas have the biggest number of millennials, in addition to which areas that are gaining the most, and it differs quite a bit for these. So it has a lot to do with where movement is and where the original populations are when you generalize and want to talk about millennials. Here's a national picture. These show the states that have the largest shares of minorities among millennials. And you see the dark red states, there's 10 of them. A lot of them are in the Southwest, but also Florida and Georgia and Maryland and New Jersey have more than half of their millennial population minorities. California, only 30% of the millennial population is white. There's another sort of less dark red. That's another 10 states where minorities are at least 40% of the millennial population. And then there's these yellow states. Those are states that are 80% white among millennials, but they're a group of small states, and they're sort of shrinking over time in terms of their white status. Places like Wyoming and Iowa and West Virginia and so forth. If you look at metro areas, there's even a wider variation. 30 of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas have minority white populations for their millennial populations, including like Los Angeles, Houston, New York, Atlanta, and Chicago, although their minority populations are of different mixes. In Los Angeles, more than half are Hispanics. In places like New York and Chicago, if you add together the Asian and the black population, it almost equals the Hispanic population. There's only 4 of these large metropolitan areas that are more than 80% white in their millennial population, places like Pittsburgh and Provo, Utah, and Knoxville are 3 of them. Another way to look at this is the racial profiles of urban-suburban cores. There's a lot of literature that shows that all millennials are moving to cities, and they're never going to go to the suburbs, and this is going to be the way of the future, and cities are going to revive because of this. I have written other stuff about this I'm not going to go into in great detail, but I think now that the economy is coming back, this kind of this city growth, the city magnetism for young people is easing up a little bit as they're starting to be able to get some more finances to get mortgages, starting to raise families, and maybe starting to move to the suburbs a little more. But this chart tells something different. It shows the racial profiles of different parts of the metropolitan area. The urban core, the mature suburbs, which are sort of close-in, highly dense suburbs, outer emerging suburbs, and then exurbs. And as the further you go out from the central core, the larger the millennial population that's white. In another analysis, which I didn't put a chart on, I looked at the contributions of whites and minorities to the growth of each of these different parts of the metropolitan area. And in all parts of the metropolitan area, minorities account for most of the growth of the millennial population, which is not surprising given the fact that minorities are a large share of the overall millennial population. So when you think about cities growing in millennials, you need to also think about diversity. When we talk about the socioeconomic characteristics of millennials, and here I'm going to focus on educational attainment, which I said before is something that millennials have been very good at improving on compared to earlier generations. But there's a big variation in educational attainment around the United States. About 36% of millennials have graduated from college at age 25 to 34, 39% for millennial women. But in Boston, 58% of millennials graduated from college. And all those black dotted cities down the East Coast, Hartford, New York, Washington, D.C., Raleigh, all have very higher than 45% in terms of the percentage of millennials who graduated from college. Throw in Madison, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Denver, as well as San Francisco and San Jose. Those are the ones, all of which 45% or more of the population has graduated from college. Then on the other side are places where less than 25% of the population of millennials has graduated from college. A number of them in the interior part of California, the state of Washington, down in the coast at the southern border in Texas, and several in Florida. So there's a disparity here. And when you're thinking about millennials and their education and how well educated they are, it really depends on where you're living and depends on what their attributes are. If you want to use them as a way of reinvigorating your economy, your business climate, and so forth. In some places, it means either attracting them from other places, more highly educated millennials, or doing what you can to make sure the homegrown millennials are doing better in terms of their educational attainment. And this is kind of a map of that. I also, in the report, look at how different racial groups vary in terms of their educational attainment across metropolitan areas. For both whites and blacks, 3 metropolitan areas stand out as the most highly educated millennial areas: Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Boston. In Washington, D.C., and in San Francisco, 70% of whites have graduated from college. This is the whole metropolitan area. And more than 32% of blacks have graduated from college. In a place like, in terms of the other racial groups, Asians, of course, have a much higher level of educational attainment than the other groups, 62% nationally for millennials aged 25 to 34. But in some of the cities that have the highest rates of growth, like San Jose, more than 80% of Asian millennials have college degrees. So it depends on where you are. Now let's get back to what this bridge generation that I've been talking about. You know, we talk about the generation gap in the United States, and I can remember in the 1960s, people talked about the generation gap. Back then, of course, the young people in college or maybe in their early 20s, were very rebellious. I mean, this was a generation gap where you were talking about the women's movement, you were talking about the civil rights movement, you were talking about protests against the war in Vietnam, you were talking about a different kind of culture. You know, there's the Woodstock generation, the Summer of Love in San Francisco. These were all aspects of the younger generation back then who really didn't see fit to look at some of the world different, the same way that their parents did, the kind of World War II generation. So what does that mean today? Is there a generation gap today between the millennials and the older generation? Well, you bet. It could be their attitudes about things like, legalization of marijuana or same-sex marriage, or the fact that they have a disdain for some of the institutions, the political structure, organized religion, and things like that. But I think one of the biggest gaps that we're seeing have to do with race and culture. We look at this. Again, I'm putting together those age-race diagrams in a more concise way. And here I'm looking at millennials' race ethnicity, compare them with pre-millennials, people older than age 35, and post-millennials, people younger than age 18. And here you can see right away that the race ethnic distribution of these three groups are quite different. And I have a theory a little bit. I can take advantage of my age. I was still living in the 1950s, and I remember that when I was young, immigration was very low in the United States. At one point during the 1950s, immigration was down to 5% of the U.S. population, not the 14% that it is today. The only immigrants that I knew were grandparents of some of my young friends who were immigrated over the turn of the previous century from places like Poland and Italy and Germany and places like that. So that part of diversity was very different. The largest racial minority in the United States back then were African Americans. But if you think segregation is high today, and it really is, it was through the roof back in the 1950s. And that all goes to say this, that most people who were white in the United States in the 1950s, unless they lived in a place like San Francisco or New York or Miami, but for most of the rest of the country, they didn't have much to do with racial minorities. And these are the people now in their 50s and 60s and 70s who are a little bit scared about what's going on in terms of the country's changeable race ethnicity. You don't think they should be because it's all kind of happened gradually, but it seems to come out in all kinds of surveys. Pew has done a number of surveys to look at this. Even before Donald Trump, back in 2011, Pew did a survey that showed that white baby boomers and white seniors felt that immigration from other countries was a threat to American values, a threat to American principles in the U.S. They show time and time again they're not too happy about all the new immigration that's coming to the United States, new numbers of Hispanics, new number of Asians coming to the U.S. And they're just, feel like the country is going in the wrong direction demographically. So I think, Donald Trump didn't invent this hate or fear, but he sort of fueled it along a little bit, and I think we've seen the results of that. And his election, his famous saying, "Let's make America great again," may mean a lot of things to this older generation. One of them, of course, might be economic. They look back at all the booming industries that we had in the 1950s and the 1960s, steel and cars and all of that sort of thing, and, maybe Donald Trump can bring that again. But the other thing they're kind of afraid of, I think, is also the changing demography and the changing in race and ethnic demography in the U.S. And that's why it plays so well with this group to talk about too much immigration to the United States. Also the idea we need to be tougher, law enforcement kind of thing, and also deal with what does all this political correctness have to do. So that I think ties into something that has been there generationally to begin with, and sort of feeds on it a little bit. The good news is that the younger generation has a very different view of these kinds of changes. If you look at the last three elections, the last three presidential elections, the two that elected Barack Obama and the one that elected Donald Trump, the underage 40 population voted for the Democratic candidate who was more in favor of social programs on inclusion, on reaching out to young, diverse generations in all kinds of ways. The older population over age 40 voted for the Republican candidates in those 3 elections. Interestingly, the popular vote was won by the Democrat in all of each of those elections, which shows you the impact that the younger population can and will have in the future if they vote in similar kinds of ways. Another thing that comes up when you look at these surveys is very, very different attitudes about the future of America between the younger population and the older population. So if you look at this is from a PRRI survey, the Public Religion Research Institute in Washington, which asked people since 1950, do you agree American culture has changed mostly for the better? And this is broken down by people who are aged 18 to 34 and age 35 and above. On the left side for the total population, yes, the younger people, the millennials think that we're changing for the better. The older generation, not so much. What's interesting here is to look at the middle panel, that there's still this split within the white population. So it's not just cutting across racial lines. Even among the white population, the white young millennials are much more open and have a better idea about Americans' future. Now, there are other questions on the survey that ask about whether immigrants are good for the country or not, whether you think America is going in the right direction or the wrong direction. And all of those, the younger population in total and among the white population has a much more favorable, a much more inclusive view of what's going on in the country. And this is true in lots of other surveys. A Pew survey has asked young whites what do they think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and 60% of them are very much in favor of what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing and what it stands for. For the older population, it's almost the reverse. So there's this kind of shift that's going on. This is kind of disparity going on, and I think it's if you look at a lot of the different surveys that have been taken of millennials per se. There's a survey taken by the Harvard Institute of Government that do a lot of survey of young people and millennials. They have shown that when they look at millennials of different parties, different regions of the country, different educational attainment status, more than half of millennials in each of those different groups said that they're in favor of something that's going to unite the country rather than divide the country in a whole series of different questions. Now, this cultural generation gap that I like to say that we can see nationally differs across different parts of the country. One state that has a very high cultural generation gap, I'll get there, is Arizona. I looked at states with different, and I measured this by what percentage of the under 18 population is white compared to what percent of the over age 65 population is white. And you can see here that in Arizona, it's a very sharp division. It's not hard to understand. Arizona has gotten several waves of immigrants from Mexico, some spillover from California of various groups, Latinos, Asians, and so forth, and then also attracting a lot of older white seniors for many years. So you can see what brings the demography of that cultural generation gap together. But Arizona's been kind of a flashpoint in all kinds of politics. The law that they proposed now back in 2010 about being able to pull somebody over for a traffic ticket and then find out whether or not they have legalization papers and then turn them in somehow or another. That was some of that was ruled down by the Supreme Court, but it came up in Arizona of all states and spread out similar kinds of laws in other states. And so I think states that have large, growing young minority populations, kind of an older state white population, are the most ripe for these kinds of divisions, although we see it in other parts of the country as well as in a state like Arizona. There was a study done by a group called First Focus in Washington. They focus on the interests of young children. And they used this cultural generation gap measure that I came up with and tried and calculated for different states. And they found that those states that had the biggest cultural generation gap, where the young population was most racially diverse, those are the states that did the least in terms of putting money into public education when those bills came up. They had a lot of sort of sophisticated measures of this. So they actually said this was kind of a demonstration of how the cultural generation gap is changing public policy. So it's the millennial generation that I think is going to be the bridge, and I think that's where that's going to have to happen. I'm going to go back to some demography again. And how will the millennial population sort of move ahead and be able to continue this role as a bridge between the older and the younger generation? Well, here's 2015, where we saw the millennials were between age 18 and 34. 2025, 7 years from now, they're going to be between age 28 and 44. And in 2035, they're going to be between the ages of 38 and 54. So if you're a millennial and you think you're always going to be stuck in this young adults thing, this graph pretty much shows, you know, you're going to grow old just like the rest of us. But what's interesting enough is that in 2015, 3 years ago, only about a quarter of the population was younger than millennials, and about half the population was older than millennials. When we get up to 2035, less than a third of the population is going to be older than millennials, and almost half of the population is going to be younger than millennials. So by then, millennials are going to be moving into positions of responsibility in the private sector, in government, in politics, and all of this. They're really going to have, you know, some clout. But even then, if you look at the right side of this chart, those are, in 2035, the racial composition of millennials when they're age 38 to 54 compared to the population who's age 55 and over, which is still a lot whiter. And even though they've gone through all of this, they're going to have opportunity to make an impact, to show the whole population how they can get ahead, take advantage of their ability to succeed, and push back against the kind of barriers that have been put against racial minorities. Over the next 20 years, they're going to play a very important role in how we see diversity in the United States, how millennials are accepted, the kind of leadership roles they take, all of that. Demographically, it's right here. People need to understand that. Now, I've been talking about the nation as a whole. This cultural generation gap differs in different parts of the country. Now, there's Los Angeles, which is minority white. For all of the pre-millennials, the millennials, and post-millennials, this is for 2025. I projected these numbers. So in Los Angeles in 2025, millennials, more than half millennials are going to be Latinos. At that, the first time people of that age, which you might say younger middle age, between ages 28 to 44, are going to be more than half Latinos. In Atlanta, for the first time, people of that age are going to be minority white, where black's going to be very important. In Chicago, there'll be more Latinos than there are blacks, but there's still going to be a minority white population of millennials in 2025. And in Minneapolis, St. Paul, even though it's still kind of a whiter metropolitan area projected to be, there's still a disparity, and there is a cultural generation gap. So depending on what city you're in, it's going to take a different portrait of what the millennial population is and what they can do and how they can make a difference. It's not the same for the U.S. as a whole, but it's there everywhere in a different form, in a different way. So I want to sort of conclude by saying, where are we going with the millennial generation in the future? I feel that they are going to they need to play this important role. I mean, if you think about millennials in the abstract, you think, well, this is a new kind of generation. They feel like they're self-empowered. They feel they may not own anything. They're going to use Ubers. They're going to only rent their houses. They're big on social media and all that. But I think the most defining characteristics of millennials is their racial diversity and how they're going to use that racial diversity, that attribute, as a bridge between the America of the past and the America of the future. I think this is really important in how we're going to do this. And I think they're well on their way. There are some very important attributes that are positives among millennials. They're the most educated generation to ever come along. They're the most inclusive-minded generation to have of their age group that has ever come along. But they also have some things to deal with. They have to deal with this gap that exists within the millennial generation on inequality with respect to education, with respect to home ownership, with respect to potential wealth accumulation. Not only do they have to deal with it, their issues, because they're such an important generation, have to be put on the spotlight for all of us to deal with, those of us who didn't raise our hand when I asked who was going to be millennials. I think that's really going to be important. There's also the political division that we're seeing so important today in the United States, every day in the news. It's mind-numbing sometimes. I really hope that some politicians can come along and see some of these charts that I've been showing and understand why it's so important to invest in this younger generation. They're a smaller generation. They're going to have to support this huge older population, especially after they retire. That needs important attention, And we don't really see very much about that in the local politics today. But I think, millennials themselves are going to be a bigger part of the voting population. They already have a bigger eligible voter population than do baby boomers. They just don't turn out as much because young people don't turn out as much on election day. But that will soon change as they get to be a little bit older and as the baby boomers tend to fade into the background. So at least at the ballot box, they're going to be able to make their presence known, and I think that's going to be very important in the future. But I'm optimistic about the future of millennials in the U.S., and one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because millennials are optimistic themselves. There's an organization called Gen Forward at the University of Chicago, which does surveys of millennials and oversamples minority groups so that they can get a full sample of what these different groups think. And when they do their surveys, one of their surveys show that Hispanics, Asians, and blacks had higher expectations about what millennials could achieve in the future than whites even, in terms of how they could do better than their parents and in terms of how they thought their whole generation could do better than their parents' generation. Now that's optimism, if you think that in this day and age. I think that's really important to understand. So I'm optimistic because they're optimistic. I'm also optimistic because I'm a demographer. And a demographer thinks that demography is really important. And this phrase, demography is destiny, which I've tried to show in all of these charts here today, is telling you a story about where the country is headed in terms of its changing demography. As these millennials turn from their 20s to their 30s, from their 30s to their 40s, and from their 40s to the 50s, they're going to have increasing impact in this country because of their size and how they're going to be able to move into positions of responsibility, be it in business, be it in government, be it in popular culture. And as they become the face of this country, not only within the country, but to the rest of the world, I think people are going to have a whole new view about diversity and the importance of diversity. At least I think and hope that that's going to be the case. So I'm banking on millennials as a bridge generation, and it's going to take a lot of work from all of us to make it work, but I think it will. Thank you.
So in reading through Bill's report several months ago and thinking about this session today, we thought it was critically important to actually hear from the people who were living through this. So I am so fortunate that pretty much every day I get to live with millennials. I work on a college campus. And I have to agree with Bill that I'm really, really optimistic about the future. And I think we're going to hear over the next couple of minutes, I hope, I haven't prompted them, but viewpoints from our panelists on the change they're actually living through and how it might affect their future in a new and unique way. So let me introduce them really quickly. On my left is Sasha Johnson-Freyd. Sasha is a PhD student in sociology here at Stanford. Her undergraduate degree is in evolutionary biology of plant-insect symbiosis, while she was also taking studies, classes in environmental engineering and gender studies. She worked as a visual designer in the tech industry after college, but found her way to the Stanford Center on Longevity and was a research assistant with us for a year where she sort of began to breathe all of this information about these changing populations. And then she decided to go pursue a graduate degree in sociology. So next to Sasha is Gabrielle Cannon, who I also have to say our panelist reflects this educational shift in the millennials. Gabrielle has a master's in specialized journalism and a bachelor's in music business and peace and conflict resolution. She's an investigative reporter and a documentary filmmaker focusing on social issues, business and culture, and narrative storytelling. And her work has been published in Vice, The Atlantic, PBS, The Guardian, and the National Geographic, among others. And then we have Eduardo Vaya, who was born and raised in San Jose to Mexican immigrants. He attended San Jose City College and transferred to UC San Diego, where he completed his bachelor's in chemical engineering in 2015. He then started the chemical engineering PhD program here at Stanford in the fall of 2015. I have to say, Eduardo and I were talking yesterday, and he's like, Martha, there's a problem with the reactor. I may need to get back to you. He assured me it was not a big deal. Finally, we're lucky to have this session moderated by Aliya Saperstein, who is a sociologist and demographer with degrees from the University of Washington and the University of California, Berkeley, and has been teaching here at Stanford since 2011. In 2016, she received the Early Achievement Award from the Population Association of America, and she has also been a visiting scholar at the Paris Institute of Political Studies and the Russell Sage Foundation. Her research focuses on social processes through which people come to perceive name and employ seemingly immutable categorical differences, such as race and sex, and their consequences for explaining and reinforcing social inequality. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and we will have time at the end for some questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming this afternoon to this excellent opportunity to discuss where we're headed as a country. As a demographer, if it's not a Friday, if I'm not looking at racial population distribution. So I'm so glad to be doing this with all of you today. So my job here is to pepper the panel with questions, and we'll hopefully generate a nice discussion up here. But then, as Martha said, we will turn things over to you to get questions from the audience. But so my first question for the panel, and this is based on what sort of came up for me as I was reading Bill's report. Can you think of an example? Bill really emphasizes this cultural gap and the way that changing racial and ethnic diversity among your generation in particular is shaping the way that we're moving forward. So ponder for a moment, if you will. And I have to say, so I'm a member of Gen X, which means that I'm sandwiched between the boomers and the millennials, and I'm just going to sit back and let them do all the work. So you guys get to answer this difficult question. Can you think of an example of a time when this culture gap between your generation and previous generations influenced your experiences growing up? So a moment where this gap really shaped your experiences at school or on the playground, or for some of you now at work. Or does the culture and diversity gap not resonate with your experiences so far? Is it something that sort of hasn't been at the forefront of your experiences growing up?
So I guess I'll start off. I don't think I've ever experienced the generation gap or diversity gap in terms of generation, but more in terms of location. I feel like where I grew up, I grew up in a community that was primarily Hispanic. Went to schools that were primarily Hispanic, 60 or 70%. And so I never saw that gap between different generations. And it wasn't until I started going to college that I actually noticed how many more whites and Asians there were in educational systems. And I think it influenced me in a different way in terms of just the feeling, the sense of belonging somewhere. Growing up, since I always had Hispanic friends, I wasn't used to not having Hispanic friends. Speaking Spanish was something that I would do on a daily basis, and something that I wouldn't do afterwards when I went to college, just because none of my friends were Hispanic. And I think that's how it influenced me. And even now, it still continues, even here today. Anyway, but I think there's a lot more here just because I'm in the Bay Area. Before, I was in UC San Diego, which is in a very primarily white community. But I think that's how I felt generation gap in terms of geographical location.
Yeah, I think that it was really interesting just to see the research, because growing up, it wasn't something that I think I noticed in any kind of way, but I did grow up in an area in Southern California where in my school system, it was LAUSD, and so it was white minority. And in terms of being young, that wasn't anything that seemed strange to us. Like, it was just very normalized and comfortable. And but at the same time, I mean, we got to see sort of the nastiness of a power structure that was in the community, at least with this older generation, and some of the unfortunate actions that happened when we were young in school, and looking at a lot of these kids that were coming in from other areas outside of our town. And so I think when you sort of opened and looking at on how this power structure is going to start to change as the demographics change, that was something that sort of resonated with me in seeing that the people who are my age felt very much like we were all peers, and that wasn't anything that was strange. But there was definitely a shift with some of the people that were in our community. So.
Yeah, and I echo similar things that these other panelists have said. And And I think something that I've noticed that's related to this cultural generation gap is this focus on, or at least more acceptance of fluidity of these categories. And I think this is related to the proportion of people that identify in different categories. So we can see this in race and ethnicity. I see this in gender, basically, that I see more and more discussions about accepting it. Maybe it's biraciality or multiraciality, or maybe it's non-binary gender identities, whatever it is, that there's more language and more acceptance of talking about fluidity between these categories. And I'm not sure this is really a generational difference versus something that's changing over time. But I think it's interesting to think about, especially when we're looking into the future, because I think it's hard to know whether the categories we use right now to think about people will be the categories we use in 20, 40 years. And we've seen this, for example, with race and ethnicity. We've seen this, for example, in the way that race has been measured, even on the census, has changed so much. Every decade it's slightly different, and it reflects, in some ways, the way that sort of people understand these categories. And we see this shift, we're seeing this shift now, and I think we will continue to see that, and it's hard to know what that will look like.
Yeah, these are all very interesting stories, and I think what I would add is that the reason I started talking about older baby boomers as part of the cultural generation gap is more that they're the ones that are maybe promoting this more than the younger generation, and even more so geographically. If you look at parts of the country that are really pretty white, not California, not the Bay Area, but good parts of upstate New York or the Midwest, these are just look at the states that won in the 2016 election for the Republican candidate. These are folks who don't come into contact as much with a younger generation that has these kind of new attributes that we see in much of the country and spreading out to more of the country. But I think there's just a fear of the unknown, and so fortunately for a lot of people here, you haven't experienced that, which is a good thing. But I think from a national perspective, in terms of national politics, that the country is yet to come to grips. Large parts of the country have yet to come to grips with the changing diversity, and it's coming. It's happening. The demography shows it's coming. But in some parts of the country, there's going to be a little bit of tension for a while, I think.
All right, Gabby, the next question is for you, since you're our workplace millennial. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how you see, or if you see, intergenerational tensions and how you see those relationships playing out in your workplace.
Yeah. So, and my workplace is actually, I think, it's sort of a unique environment, right? So I'm a journalist, and even though right now I'm working independently on some of my own work, I've been in newsrooms for many years. And so not only am I able to sort of see my own experience and the way that people are engaging in my office environment, but it's also playing out in this very dramatic way because the media, of course, is responsible for telling us things about ourselves. So, you look at the types of people who predominantly work in journalism, and for a very long time, I think continuing today, it's been more affluent white men, maybe not affluent after you get into journalism, but certainly starting out. And so I think that there's been this shift, not only when you're talking about the demographics and the way that our society is changing, but also with the way that we consume media and the way that that's changing has really put more of an emphasis on requiring younger people to take leadership positions in newsrooms at a faster rate, because there's a different way to communicate. There's this digital disruption that has happened. So I've kind of seen this power struggle happen in a dramatic way in real time, in both trying to make sure that newsrooms themselves are more representative of our readers and of society, and also that there's this way that the communication is changing. And so it's been difficult, and it's been something that I think the news industry is really still struggling to figure out. And this identity crisis is really happening in a big way. And so it's been so interesting to, to see your presentation and how this is affecting people on more of a national level, whereas I've seen it on a much more personal level in my own work and in the jobs that I've had. So I think ultimately there's been this shift toward trying to make sure that there are more voices and more millennials involved in decision making and in editorial leadership positions. But there's also still this legacy media that has not changed and has really resisted that shift. And as a result, I think that you're talking about how millennials are sort of described as these white people who live in Brooklyn. And I think that comes a large part from that issue of not having really diverse representation in newsrooms. So,
thank you. All right, Eduardo, the next one is for you. What do you think your parents and earlier generations least understand about your generation?
It's a good question. At least for my parents, I think it's a little different than from generations previous from here, just because they grew up in Mexico, very conservative and religious. But I think one of the things that they point out a lot is cell phone usage, media consumption. I feel like they're always pointing out when we're on our phones, or like, why are you guys always on your phone? And I feel like I notice that as well, and I try to use my phone less. And I notice that with my little cousins, they're like always on YouTube. Even like my little nieces, they're like 1 or 2 years old, and they're already using cell phones. And just, I guess, also the change in terms of conservative to a little more liberal, at least especially in this state. My mom, a funny example that she always points out is that she tells me that when she went to school in elementary school that they always separated the men and the boys and the girls, and they would have recess at different times. And then she's like, I don't know why they put you guys in the same classroom together. Like, it's always socializing together. And that is pretty funny. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things is media consumption, I would say.
How do you think the trajectory of your life, or the life of your generation more generally, will differ from that of your parents in terms of work, education, home ownership, life goals, all of the factors that Bill highlighted in his report? And perhaps in particular, how much do you think the timing of the Great Recession will play a role in those differences?
Well, I think I'll answer for myself instead of my whole generation, because it might be a little bit easier. And I think
her preliminary exam is coming in September, so
I think I can think of sort of two different ways to answer this question. One is thinking about the specific ages that I've reached milestones and that my parents have reached milestones, et cetera. And then the other way to think about it is thinking about sort of like the spirit of the life trajectory, sort of as more or less is our American dream or whatever it is our vision of the future similar? And I think overall, the punchline is I think it's actually pretty similar. I think that if we look at specific ages, undoubtedly my experience and also my experience of my friends and other people my age, I think is overwhelmingly that it's everything's later, and that's what we see with trends with marriage rates, home ownership rates, et cetera. I definitely see that, at least in some domains. But I think that, at least in my experience, and I have no assumption that this is representative, in part because I come from a very particular background, and so I think this is sort of specific to my social class, where I grew up, et cetera. But that the overall trajectory, I think, feels pretty similar. I have similar plans. I have this idea that I'm going to get married and have kids and have a job and somehow reach this thing that is adulthood. And I think that's similar from what at least my understanding is that previous generations have seen as well. I think it's interesting then to think actually into looking even further into the future and thinking about how people will see themselves and what people's plans are for later in their life. And that's something that I know in part because these are conversations that I'm having with my parents and other people their generation. And I think in some ways that's similar too, in that I think there's a lot of openness about what all of life is going to look like. And so yeah, I guess overall similar is my answer.
All right, so this one can be for all of you, each of you in turn, if you will. Considering all of the data that was presented about your generation, it must be weird to sit there while somebody else talks talks about you. Nobody ever talks about Gen X, so I don't have this problem. Was there anything that particularly surprised you, either in the presentation or in the report as a whole? Or is there anything that you felt was missing from the portrait that you thought you would see but wasn't there?
I think that one thing I was struck by this presentation and some of the research that was talked about is really how it opens the door for more research. And I mean, I'm saying this in part because I study sociology and demography, so I'm invested in this agenda of research, but I really think it does. I think there's so many questions that this raises. For example, I think thinking about even these generational categories, there's some research now showing sort of comparing these generational categories, but I think there's so much more that has to be done. For example, is millennial as a category really that meaningful to people? I think that questions like this are beginning to be addressed, but haven't entirely. And I think a related sort of call for future research that I see that Bill talked about a little bit is this issue of the lack of equalization over time, that we're seeing these same divides, these same inequalities that we've seen, from decades previously. They're still here, and in some ways they're even greater. And I think that we don't understand why, and we need to do something about that because of thinking about the future. So really, we need more sociological research.
Yeah, and I can sort of build on that as well, in the sense of, I agree, it's like this research is so important, especially considering the kind of profile that we have seen about millennials in the media and the sort of shallow sense of, like avocado toast is basically, like what we think, So I think that was really interesting to sort of get that deeper picture. But I think also, I almost hate to frame it this way, but the thing that was sadly surprising was the sense of optimism. It's both encouraging and surprising. And so I think in my line of work, there's so much focus on the problems and the issues and the ways that that inequality is increasing and the ways that these the power dynamics are becoming just more polarized. And so it's exciting to see that these shifts are happening and that people are actually hopeful and that they believe that there are positive changes that are coming. And hopefully that this will also mean that, as you pointed out, that the voting population, millennials are going to be a much larger voting generation if they actually show up. And so to me, it's sort of a wake-up call to say, if these changes are going to occur, the kinds of changes that millennials themselves have identified as important, then it's going to be really essential to make sure that they actually have their voices heard.
For me, I think what stood out the most was some of the data that you showed on education, and especially putting into a personal context in terms of about 1 in 5 Hispanics attain a bachelor's degree, and especially because I'm on the lower end of the 25 to 34-year-old spectrum that you showed, and my sister's on the 34 end, and just to think that every Hispanic between my age and my sister's age, only 1 in 5 of them actually get an education. I thought that was a pretty eye-opening fact that you pointed out there. And just to think about 1 in 5 of my friends that I grew up with are going to get an education, meaning I was 1 out of the 5, this kind of puts me in a position where I guess I appreciate the opportunities I have received and the position that I'm in right now. And also, I guess I also see the changes that need to be taken, that need to take place in order to change that. And hopefully I can somehow do some outreach to promote those numbers and hopefully keep that trend going in terms of how many Hispanics are actually going into higher education. And also the fact that the statement that you made about the millennials being a little more hopeful or having being optimistic about the future, I think that's also something that you said the minorities were more optimistic, and I think that's because from my personal experience, my parents coming from Mexico have coming here with nothing, and then me being able to be in a place here like Stanford, I think that's why we're more optimistic, because we have a lot of room for growth, and because I personally am optimistic as well. But yeah, that was one of the things that stood out to me.
Bill, do you want to have a last chance to
No,
respond
I-
before we send it out to the audience? So start thinking about your questions.
Sure. Well, I certainly agree that we need more research. Okay. And so the kinds of things I've tried to frame sort of opens the door for other ways to approach this. There's a whole, research on inequality that really can be brought to bear on from a generational standpoint, perhaps more than it has before, with the changing demography that blends into the inequality that we see in the U.S. And I think that's an area that we have to deal with. The political aspect of this, is something I think we should continue to be thinking about and understand how, as younger people start paying more attention to politics, and perhaps that they should now in the current environment, that pay particular attention on the millennials. And whether the idea about millennials as a classification, I'd be the first to say that it's a kind of an abstract term. Most people, if you look at the research on millennials, almost every researcher uses a different definition, and they constantly change. It's a nice marketing, it's a nice marketing label, but there's something about it. I think millennials really do feel in the same way that baby boomers have some kind of a feel about it. So it captures an essence of a generation, even though it's not very precisely defined in terms of age groups and so forth. So I think that's very important. And the part about millennials feeling optimistic, I think that idea is right. That when you have young people coming to the U.S. Whose parents are born somewhere else, or just new generations feeling that they have that kind of opportunity, it just brings a lot of hope, and it brings a lot of optimism. And it would be important, I think, that civic leaders and politicians and community leaders understand that and are able to harness that in ways even better in the future than they've been able to do now.
Hi, I have a question for Bill. When I was looking at your presentation and hearing your presentation, it reminded me kind of California, and that California is also a bridge to the future for the whole country, because what the country is undergoing right now is where we were, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And I think Manuel Pastor, who's I don't know if he's a demographer, but he's at USC, he recently came out with a book like that, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a little. I feel, just because as a state, we've been there and done that, and I remember when, and where I grew up, my local grocery store used to be a Safeway, and then it became El Tigre, and so if you want to buy a sugar or a sugar cane, you have to buy a whole stalk of sugar cane and cut it with a machete, and but when I was little, it was a Safeway with the granulated sugar. But anyways, so we've been through it, and we came out through the other side, and just was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure, that's a very good question. When I think of California, I think of a state that's constantly in flux. If you think of the history of how California, after World War II, all of these Midwesterners moved here, and especially in Southern California, and built homes and built communities and all of that, and then the last census showed that most of the growth in California are from people born in other countries rather than born in other states, or at least some of the migrant growth in this country. And so I think of a state that's really, in a way, been forced to adapt with its institutions and its politics to all kinds of change, all kinds of demographic change. Some of the middle of the country isn't in that situation, even if they start to get some of the new minorities moving there. If they're older populations, the economy isn't that vital, and so forth. So I think the real trick is, because if you look at the national demography, you can see we have an aging of the white population. The only way we're going to be growing is with a very diverse, youthful population. And those states that are growing in terms of their child population, only half the states are showing growth in their under age 18 population. Those are the states that are bringing in minorities to account for the fact that white loss of children, it's not like white children are moving away. What's happening is you have a situation where with an aging white population, more white kids are moving past age 18 than are being born or immigrating, because it's just an aging population. And some states attract a lot of migrants, attract a lot of white migrants too. But broadly, those other states are going to have to depend on new minorities moving there in places that really haven't attracted them very much before. How they're going to adapt to that may be quite different than the way Californians have been able to adapt to this very fast-moving population change that's been here, and I think it's a real challenge. I think California could be a role model, but I think we may have to come up with some other models too for those states.
Let's do the green shirt there. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I just have a very quick clarifying question, then I can pass it your way. I was curious with some of the optimism data that you shared. Apologies if this was in there and I missed it, but when is that dating from? Since I noticed a lot of the census data you were looking at was roughly 2015. Is that where kind of that optimism data was coming from as well? And do you anticipate it would be different when the data comes out for like post 2016, 2017, 2018?
Yeah, well, that was survey data done by a group called Gen Forward, which is a research organization at the University of Chicago, I think part of NORC. And they constantly do surveys. And so I'm sure they're going to come up and continue to make those done. And as I said, the unique thing about their surveys is they oversample each of the different racial minority groups in the millennial generation, which is something you don't often see, so they can go more in depth about attitudes. And they do a lot of other things too about how they feel about their own financial situation. Some of it isn't that good for some millennials, but in terms of these attitudes about hope for the future, that's one thing that stands out. So yeah, if you get a copy of my report, it's on the web. My name, Millennials, show up. It's in the references there. You can probably get a copy of it. Yeah.
Just a quick comment and then two questions, but they're short questions. One is that in order to emphasize your whole premise, if you look at the U.S. Latino population as of 2015, they were generating $2.13 trillion of GDP. That would make it the 7th largest economy in the world, bigger than that of India. So when we think about context, when we can talk about lots of these numbers, but we have to put it in context. If you add the Latino, the African American, and the Asian American, it's about $4 trillion of effect, which would make it the 3rd largest economy in the world. So this is a very important topic. That's comment. My question for everybody on the stage is, did all of you, or those of you that live in California, did you vote in the primary? Did you? Everybody vote? Yes? Okay. I'm not trying to embarrass anybody, but this is part of, the system. The second question is, for those of you that have grown up watching television and to some extent the social media, I appreciate what you said about growing up in California, and it's not the same as perhaps the prior generation, but when you look at portrayals of people that are the stars of shows, the people that are featured versus those who are not, did you ever take notice of any of that? So that in the case of, if you look at Latinos, 90% of portrayals were essentially negative. There's now probably one star you could name. And if you look at, the rest of the core group there, you would not see that. And we know that there's 10 billion impressions made a week from entertainment media, 6 billion from advertising media, and about 3 billion from news media. That's about 2 years old, so it may have shifted some with social media. But can you comment on how you grew up thinking about other people other than yourselves in terms of what you were watching in terms of shows and entertainers that were featured, et cetera, et cetera?
So when I was young, I grew up watching a lot of Hispanic TV, so it was the opposite. But I mean, as I'm getting older and I start going to the movie theaters, and I do see what you're referring to. And yeah, I think it puts a lot of different races in a negative context, especially I feel like African Americans always put in the negative light. And it also gives you a different perception of them, makes you have first impressions upon before even meeting a certain race. And a lot of times when you actually do get to meet that race, you actually find out that a lot of the things are not true. Yeah, I think it's a very it's a very good point that you made there.
I think, yeah. Unless, did we want to chime in on the
Well, I guess
media question?
Yeah, just quickly. I think I definitely growing up didn't understand that perception. I obviously I was privileged to see a lot of people who looked like me in the media, and so it wasn't ever something that was really present in my life. But now, being older and really understanding the ways that portrayal can affect somebody's perception, and even when we don't realize it, has been something that's an important discussion. I know that is happening. I can't say in terms of all entertainment, but certainly in the news media is something that is starting to get into conversations in newsrooms, and even it's still happening in a really terrible way. And we've seen over and over just the types of the pictures that are chosen. So looking at mugshots, for example, versus someone's high school graduation photo. So something like that, I think that's a really important thing to bring up, and goes back to, I think, this whole discussion about how we see ourselves as millennials, and trying not to see that version through the eyes of something that's like a shallow portrayal. And you're talking about research and talking about who we really are as a generation, really making sure that we can define that, and that we can look at something that's more accurate rather than just sort of a character, right?
Hey, so my question is that in the United States and in the rest of the world in general, every generation has had more exposure to other types of people and other types of cultures. And because of that, I think that people have been leaning towards being more liberal and more open. So baby boomers had their time with civil rights, women's rights, and so on, and now millennials are doing it with the racial stuff. How do you define this not being just a generation gap of parents and children and the differences that they have in terms of exposure, as opposed to something more than that? And do you think that this trend of more exposure and more being more liberal and open will continue, or will it reverse course at some time?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. And, it is very true that these same baby boomers today, maybe not exactly the same ones, were a very rebellious group when they were young back in the 1960s. And as they've gotten older and more entrenched in their lives and worried more about their own finances and whatever, and sort of closed in on what's going on beyond them, at least some of them, that may be part of that attitude, and there may be something about that generationally. I'm sure there's a dissertation being written about this somewhere right now, but I think that the hope is that this younger generation, is a different. We went in the United States between about 1925 and 1965, where we had very little immigration to the U.S. We became much more sort of inward looking from that perspective. And when I talked about growing up in the 1950s, that was the America that I grew up in, and that's where a lot of people who are now in their 50s and 60s grew up in. Prior to that, we had a lot of immigration to the United States. Some of it was a little nasty between the people who were here and the new immigrants, but it did tend to blend in over time. And I think we're in that kind of period now. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think because of the flux and the change and the fact that we're soon going to understand from an economic standpoint, GDP statistics that were analyzed there, where we're going to be moving down, we're going to have to support a very old population compared to what our previous population, not old compared to Europe, we're still a little younger than a lot of European countries, but we're going to have to support that older population. People have to realize there's a necessity to this kind of openness to the younger population. I mean, a good example is if you grow up in some, not necessarily California, but someplace that's relatively white, and there's an older population, and there's an assisted living home, for example. Who are the people that are helping those older people in that assisted living home? They're often young people, minorities, because young people are minorities in most part of the country. And that's a very simple example, but I think that there's going to be these kinds of codependency, attitudes about codependency between these generations that people are going to need to understand for their economic survival. And that will empower this younger group, I think, to be more open. As I said, a very different America than I grew up in, or at least when I was younger, and a lot of people that grew up in the middle of the century. So I think that's part. Another part of it is social media. That can work two ways. I guess there are people studying about the impact of social media, but my feeling is that if people are interacting with folks from all around the world as well as people in their own community, that helps to maybe open up their attitudes about things as well. So I'm still optimistic.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to give it to Laura Karstensen to close things out.
Thank you all so much for this fascinating discussion. My question is about biracial. I was actually surprised to see it remain relatively stable in the data that you showed, Bill, and I'm wondering when the tipping point occurs where we have more biracial people than any other group.
Ooh, can I take that one? So Bill may have a slightly different answer, but my answer, since this is part of what my research is about as well, is that we have to take very seriously who is doing the reporting. So when we're dealing with 0 to 9-year-old children, most likely they're not self-identifying. Most likely their parents are recording for them. And at least the research that we have now, and certainly this can change as sort of Sasha alluded to, but most of the research that we have now suggests that when those children come of age, they do not necessarily report themselves the same way that their parents check boxes for them. So that makes the projections really challenging. And some of that, they may shift to identifying only as white. They may shift to identifying only as a minority race. They may stay identifying as two or more. But that's actually one of the biggest challenges, I think, in projecting this group is knowing, particularly the post-millennial group, because we're seeing them as young children, and we sort of need to wait and see how they're going to identify as adults. And certainly the political climate that they're growing up in is going to have a lot to do with where they situate themselves in the boxes that exist.
So they have already had.
Bill, do you want to?
No, I agree.
Listen, thank you all. This was really terrific and really interesting for Friday afternoon. Thank you for your attention and your attendance.